The events begin in the future, where a person named Izzy lives in a residential neighborhood called the Kitch. This neighborhood is located on the outskirts of London and is a housing project. It becomes clear that the residents in this neighborhood are extremely poor, to the extent that they share only one bathroom. Izzy enters the bathroom and ignores the residents waiting outside, all of whom are in a hurry and also want to use the bathroom. At this time, a group of young people from the kitchen neighborhood attacks a food cart led by a young man named Stab. Stab gets onto the cart and asks the driver to stop, reassuring him that they have no issues with him and do not want to harm him. The driver responds to Stab's words and stops as requested. Meanwhile, a radio announcer named Kitch speaks and directs the residents of the kitchen neighborhood to the location where the food will be distributed. We learn that Kitch is the person who always looks hopefully at the neighborhood residents and tells them that they must unite against the government because the government wants to evict them from their homes to take over the neighborhood, demolish it, and build wealthy housing in its place. Afterward, Izzy exits the bathroom and prepares to go to work. He receives a message from a certain company offering him an apartment in the wealthy neighborhood, but it turns out Izzy doesn't have the money to pay for the first installment of the apartment, so he postpones the offer until he can come up with the full amount. Then he goes to his job at a company called Life After Life. We learn that this company buries poor people who cannot afford funeral costs and turns their bodies into trees after death so that their relatives can visit them whenever they want. There is an old man with his daughter at the company, and Izzy is with them, explaining to the person that after his death, he will be transformed into a tree. He tells him that he will remain at the company for 20 days so that his relatives can visit him during this period. Then the tree will be transferred to another place outside the city. The old man refuses the idea of turning into a tree and tells his daughter that this way he will not have a grave to visit. Izzy speaks with the person and tells him that if his relatives had the money, they would surely have held a big funeral for him and bought him a grave. But unfortunately, they are poor and cannot afford the funeral costs. He tells him that if they spent all the money they have to buy a grave and hold the funeral they want, they would not be able to survive after his death and would die immediately from hunger. He asks him to be merciful to his relatives and alleviate this burden on them. The old man is convinced by Izzy's words and agrees to turn into a tree after his death. Then Izzy meets his colleague at work named Demi and asks him if he is still thinking about leaving the kitchen neighborhood. He tells him that he will leave the neighborhood very soon because he knows that the government will take over the neighborhood at any cost. And it becomes clear that he is only thinking about himself and doesn't care about Demi's talk about resistance and defending the place they live in. Then Izzy goes to the control panel and discovers that there is a funeral for a woman named Tony. Izzy is shocked and quickly goes to the funeral room, where he sees Tony's son, Vingy, bidding her farewell. It becomes clear that Vingy is very affected by his mother's death and very sad to part with her. Then Vingy takes his mother's tree and places it in the designated place. At the end of the day, Izzy has left the company, but Vingy stops him and tells him that he saw him at the funeral and asks if he knew his mother. Izzy is surprised and confused, and he tells Vingy that he did indeed know his mother. Vingy asks him if he had a relationship with her, and Izzy tells him that his relationship with his mother was superficial. Then he leaves. Benji sits alone on the sidewalk, deeply saddened. He is surprised when Izzy returns and offers to take him home. There, Izzy discovers that Benji will be moving out of his home and going to a care center because he can't afford the rent. Benji asks Izzy about where he lives, and Izzy tells him he lives in the kitchen district. Benji mentions that his mother told him his father might be one of the residents there. Izzy becomes confused and doesn't respond, then leaves. At night, Benji goes to the kitchen district, searching for Izzy. He encounters Stab and his friends, who approach him asking what he's doing in the neighborhood. Benji, fearing they want to rob him, is reassured by Stab that they're not criminals. Benji explains he's looking for someone named Izzy and that he's homeless after being kicked out of his apartment where he lived with his deceased mother. Stab sympathizes with him and takes him to his house. There, Benji meets Stab's friends. Later that night, Benji remains distressed and sad, crying. At the same time, Izzy is in his apartment, seemingly contemplating something and unable to sleep again. The next day, the radio host Kitch plays music on the radio as usual, inspiring all the neighborhood residents and motivating them to endure the tough life they're living. At this time, Stab wakes Benji up and takes him along with his friends to the rooftop. There, Benji finds Stab and his friends working on a small mannequin. They try to target police drones but fail. It's then Benji's turn, and with intense focus, he manages to hit and bring down the drone. Stab and his friends rejoice and congratulate Benji on his achievement. Then Benji descends with Stab and his friends to the street. At this moment, Izzy exits the restaurant and is surprised to see Benji with Stab. He calls out to him, asking what he's doing in the neighborhood, showing his annoyance at Benji being with Stab. Benji tells him he was looking for him and that he has nowhere to go since he was evicted from the apartment he lived in with his mother, who passed away. Izzy warns Benji that there will come a day when the police will launch a major attack on the residents and apprehend them all at once. He then asks Benji to stay away from Stab and his friends because they engage in violent acts against the police, in addition to carrying out attacks on areas where the wealthy reside and stealing from them. Izzy tells him that if he participates in anything they do, he might get caught, and at that time, Stab and his friends won't be able to save him. Benji asks Izzy why he cares about him in this way, and here we understand that Benji feels that Izzy is his father, whom his mother told him about before her death. But Izzy remains silent and doesn't respond. Benji asks Izzy to live with him in his apartment, but Izzy refuses, telling him that he will leave soon, and besides, he can't afford to support him. Benji begs Izzy to let him stay with him for just 2 days, until he sorts out his affairs, finds a job, and a place to live. Izzy sympathizes with him and agrees to let him stay in his apartment for 2 days. Then Izzy takes Benji with him to his workplace. There, Izzy teaches Benji a specific phrase about his experience of turning his mother into a tree, so he can say it in front of the customers visiting the company, convincing them of the service and making them subscribe to it, thus earning a lot of money behind them. But Benji forgets the phrase Izzy taught him. He is surprised when he sees Benji speaking truthfully in front of the customers from his heart. Benji says that whenever he looks at the tree, he imagines it's really his mother, and that he must take care of it and protect it throughout his life. The customers are moved by Benji's words and contract with the company. At night, Izzy takes Benji, and they go to an amusement park, and Izzy is very happy. Izzy watches Benji enjoying his time. By coincidence, Demi is present there, sees Izzy, approaches him, and asks him about Benji. But Izzy denies knowing him and takes Demi to have a drink. Benji is surprised when he suddenly finds Izzy disappeared in front of him, so he continues to search for him everywhere but can't find him. Benji sees Stab and his friends in front of him, so he goes to them and plays with them. Then they go to the nightclub and continue dancing and singing all night. The next day, Benji is with Stab having breakfast. Stab asks Benji about his relationship with Izzy, and Benji tells him that Izzy is his friend. Then Stab speaks with Benji alone and tells him that the government wants to seize their land at any cost, to give it to the rich and build luxurious buildings on it, and make a lot of money from it. Stab says that the government cuts off their water and prevents food from reaching them, so he and his friends defend their land and fight the government. And they steal to help the residents of the neighborhood. Stab asks Benji to join them and become one of them, and he gives him a motorcycle, telling him that the motorcycle now belongs to him from that moment. Benji agrees. Then he goes with Stab and participates in a motorcycle race, and Benji is very happy with his new friends and his new life. Then Benji meets a girl his age named Ruby, and they sit together and talk. Suddenly, Izzy appears, and it turns out he was looking for Benji. Izzy takes the motorcycle back and returns it, then takes Benji and goes to the restaurant and has breakfast together, and Benji is sad and doesn't feel like eating because Izzy left him alone last night. Izzy apologizes to him, but advises him to get used to living his life alone. Izzy tells him his story, saying that his father and mother died when he was young, and he lived life and faced difficulties without help from anyone. Benji is happy when Izzy tells him he will live with him forever, so he feels like eating and completes his breakfast. Days pass, and Izzy and Benji get closer to each other, appearing as if they're a father and son living their ordinary lives together, until the day comes when Izzy goes to the company from which he will rent his new apartment. And it turns out that Izzy managed to gather the deposit for the apartment. Izzy looks at apartment models to choose one, and he asks the robot to look at models for a 2-person apartment, understanding that Izzy wants to take Benji to live with him permanently. The robot asks for confirmation of his request, and here Izzy hesitates and is unable to make a decision because he doesn't know if he can afford rent for a 2-person apartment or not. Night falls, and Benji asks Izzy what he did about the new apartment matter, and he tells him that he wants to work to help him pay the rent, but Izzy doesn't respond to Benji and leaves him and goes to sleep. The next day, Izzy and Benji are at the restaurant having breakfast, and suddenly Izzy tells him that he will leave on a mission and will return to him. Benji remains sitting, waiting for Izzy at the restaurant all day, but unfortunately, Izzy does not return. Here, Benji understands that Izzy left him and abandoned him. The next day, Izzy is in the new apartment, which is certainly much better than his apartment in the Kitchen district. We return to the Kitchen district again and find Stab and his friends distributing food and clothes to the neighborhood residents, while Benji sits in the apartment, sad because he was left alone. Suddenly, the police attack the neighborhood as usual. Ruby, Benji's friend, tries to quickly return to her home, but she feels scared when she sees the police arresting her mother. She runs quickly and knocks on the door of the apartment, and Benji opens the door for her from the inside. At the same time, the police attack Kitch's apartment and try to arrest him, but he resists them. They beat him and torture him, and all the residents of the neighborhood hear his voice screaming because the microphone is on at that time. At night, we learn that Kitch was killed by the police. Therefore, all the residents of the Kitchen district come out of the windows and light fires as an expression of their sadness at Kitch's death. The next day, most of the residents of the Kitchen district gather their belongings and leave the place and go to Stab and his friends, who are very sad because of what happened. At this time, Izzy is at work and is shocked when he finds many residents of the Kitchen district going to the funeral room. He follows them and discovers that it's a funeral. The residents are at the peak of sorrow and anger and bid farewell to Kitch with the songs he always sang every day to keep them optimistic. Izzy is also very saddened when he finds out what happened. We go to Benji, who is with Stab and his friends, and it turns out that Stab and his friends have decided to avenge Kitch's death. They attack the commercial market and break the shops and steal everything in them. Benji goes with Stab and attacks a wealthy family's house, and Benji feels scared when he sees Stab showing all the anger inside him and breaking into the house, and the family in the house is very scared and terrified. Benji is afraid and runs away and returns home. The next day, Izzy visits Benji at his home and argues with him, asking him to leave, but Izzy consoles him and tells him that he will not leave him again, and he gives him the tree that belonged to his mother. Benji calms down and thanks Izzy. Then they go up to the roof and plant the tree together. Suddenly, a police raid occurs on the neighborhood, and people run away from the police as fast as they can. The police continue to chase them until they are surprised that Stab and his friends have fallen into a trap, and the police are surrounded from all sides. Then the residents throw rocks at them from the tops of the buildings to kill them. The police officers try to protect themselves with shields and request backup, but the rocks break the shields and hit them. Izzy is with Benji in the apartment and watches everything happening there. Benji asks Izzy if he is his father or not, so Izzy confesses to him that he is his father and tells him that he will take him to live with him in the new apartment. And the film ends.